Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. I'm Dr. Sarah Abosh Jacobson. I'm the Barbara Rabin Chief Education Officer here at the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. And you are in for a treat today. You will be hearing Magie Furst, who will share her story of survival on the Kindertransport as part of our 2023 Summer Survivor Speaker Series. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our community partners for the Summer Survivor Speaker Series: Attitudes and Attire, Green Hill School, Legacy Senior Communities, Southwest Jewish Congress, Temple Shalom, Texas Holocaust, Genocide, and Anti-Semitism Advisory Commission, and we're really grateful for your support of the museum and our programs. I would also like to extend a special welcome to our board members, and volunteers in the audience. We could not fulfill our mission without you. If you are interested in becoming a museum member or a volunteer, please visit our website at dhhrm.org to learn more. In just a moment, Magie will share her story with you. Then we will have time for question and answer. If you're joining us in person today, you can use the card provided to you at check-in to write out your question. Got that little golf pencil. Our staff will come around at the end of the program to collect your cards. If you are joining us virtually, please use the Q&A function that's at the bottom of your screen to type out and submit your questions, and we will get to as many of those questions as we possibly can once Magie has finished speaking for the afternoon. And it is now my great pleasure to turn things over to...
Can't hear you.
You can't hear me at all. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Maggie, I just introduced you to your public.
Okay.
And Magie, it is now time for you to share.
Okay. Good afternoon, ladies and gents, and all my wonderful friends. And I hope that you are enjoying this beautiful weather. I'll try to give you a little information about my experiences with the Kindertransport, and this happened during the Hitler era, and subsequently I left to go to Great Britain. I was born in Germany, and I have lived in the United States now for about 80 years. Jews have lived in Germany since Roman times. In Germany, the Jewish population was well integrated by the end of the 19th century until the rise of the Nazism. Jews were part of the mainstream, and Jews were professors at universities, lawyers, doctors, writers, and scientists. Many of the department stores had Jewish owners as well as the banks. Mixed marriages were common. In general, the Jewish community consisted of Reform Jews, although there were some Orthodox congregations. Our father, Alfred Romberg, was born in Diepholz, Germany, a small town not far from Essen. Essen is a big industrial area in the Ruhr district. My father was one of 13 children. His parents were Frederica and Julius Romberg, my paternal grandparents. Our mother, Sitte Rothschild, was born to Katinka and Benjamin Rothschild in the village of Astheim, Germany, not far from Mainz. And Mainz is famous for the Gutenberg Bible. My mother was one of 4 children. My dad fought for Germany in the First World War. He was the first commissioned Jewish officer in the German army. He was wounded and awarded the Iron Cross, the highest medal given. When he met our mother, he was a handsome young bank officer in Essen. They fell in love and married in 1927. He joined the family business and became the owner upon the death of my grandfather in 1929. He took over the successful grain, feed, and general merchandise store. I was born in 1929, and my brother Bert was born in 1930. In 1934, after Hitler came to power, our dad was harassed endlessly by the stormtroopers who marched in front of our house and banged on the doors and windows and called all kinds of obscenities and threw stones through the windows day and night. And it came to a point where he was so agitated that it caused him great distress, and he died from a severe heart attack in March of 1934. At the time, I was 4.5 years old, and Bert was 3.5 years old. Mama had a very hard time getting over my father's death. I found some old newspapers she had saved, which described the funeral cortege moving through the village, and obscenities were thrown towards the people that were marching behind the cortege, and it was terrible. I started school in Astheim, and as far as I can remember, I was well treated by all my fellow schoolmates. You know, as a child, you don't, things roll off your back. Either you don't understand the situation or you go along with it. I was well treated by my schoolmates, and we played together behind closed doors with our neighbors' children. These same neighbors supplied us with food, milk, and butter, and other essentials through a common basement wall. Well, you know, in Europe, at least in those days, the houses were very close together, and they were very stable and strong, with big, heavy walls, and no hurricane or tornado would blow them down. But they made a hole in our wall and a hole in our neighbor's wall, and they were able to pass the food through to us. So that's how we survived. They supported us through many trials, and as they had in years past. We had a teenager named Elizabeth, whom we called Leah, and she took care of us while my mother and my grandmother worked in the store. Mama struggled to keep the business afloat, but as the anti-Semitic Nuremberg laws were passed, the neighbors and the villagers no longer felt it was necessary to pay Jews for the merchandise. So each day we had less and less income coming in. It got to the point where we had to close the store, and she sold the business. How much she sold it for, I don't know, but to this day, I am sure that it was very little, and whatever she could get for it. We were forced to sell it for pittance. So we moved to another town where my Aunt Paula lived, my mother's middle sister, with her family that had a little larger Jewish population, with the hope that we would have a better chance there. And that was in 1936. The name of the town was Eschwege, near Kassel, if you have any idea of the map of Germany. And we tried to overcome all the adverse conditions, but it was like going from the frying pan into the fire. Mama had to take in laundry and sewing to support us. She was ordered to go to Gestapo headquarters and hand over all our valuables, meaning that anything that wasn't worth anything we could keep, and anything that was worth something we had to hand over. It was furniture, silver, linens, anything. Of course, we didn't have a car in those days. They closed the bank account, took all the money. So we had to survive. And not only that, but then we couldn't find a place to live because the place we had to go to would have to be owned by a Jewish family. So after 3 tries, we finally found an apartment to share with another family. We were unable to attend secular schools, so we had to go to a Jewish day school. And that was really a joke. I mean, I thought it was wonderful because we didn't do anything. We played show and tell, and we would play chasing around all day, and I'm sure the teachers were pulling their hair out. The trouble was we were all in one classroom, so you can imagine how much we learned. Well, after Kristallnacht, there was no school, nor was there a synagogue to attend to. It was November the 9th, 1938, and that's when the major trouble really started. Everything that was Jewish-owned was burned, destroyed, and in ruins. Houses were ransacked. Jewish men and teenagers were dragged off to concentration camps. We saw our cousin Henry, 14 and a half, being dragged off across the town square. Actually, we were very, very lucky because my brother was still very young, so nobody came to us that night. But in the morning, when we saw what had gone on, it was just devastating. By December the 13th, 1938, Jewish industries and shops were seized. Living conditions in Eschwege were going from bad to worse. We could not go out without being beaten up by the Hitler Youth. And if you think of the word youth, you think of young children. Well, let me tell you, these kids were from 5 years up, and if you don't think that a 5-year-old can do a lot of damage, give a 5-year-old a brick, and you can't lift your hands up. They can do a lot of damage. If they all gang up on you, they can kill you, literally kill you. And they really did a lot of damage and scared us. So our father had a sister and her family living in Stockholm since 1927. So my mother appealed to them to get a visa for Bert and myself that we could go to live in Stockholm. Following Kristallnacht and appeals by Jewish committees and a debate in Parliament, the British government agreed to admit up to 10,000 children from Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia. Austria and Czechoslovakia had already been overrun by the Nazis, so there were additional children. And a 50-pound bond per child was posted to guarantee their eventual fare to some other country. They had no intentions of keeping us forever. So they wanted a guarantee with the 50 pounds that we would move on. Does it sound familiar what's happening at the border today? You will see what's going on. The British Internal Committee was established. Their goal was to raise 50,000 children now. They were mostly Jewish, but there were some non-Aryan Christian children that were also in danger. Parliament passed an emergency measure to permit these children to enter the UK. The conditions were they had to be potty trained, alone, under 17 years of age and only 2 per family. Supposing you had 3 children, or 4, or you only had 1. Who are you going to choose? You're going to let one go? Then you have no children? We didn't know what the future would bring. So they figured it would cost a minimum of £23 per year to maintain each child. That was a lot of money at that time. And most of the people that volunteered to take children in were ordinary British people, or they were poor. There was a depression going on all over the world, and Great Britain was no exception. But yet they managed to take in children. I'll give you an example. Most of you have probably heard of Sir David Attenborough, the great scientist, nature lover. His family took in two sisters. The father was a professor at Cambridge, and they loved those girls. And they took care of them for the duration of the war. And his brother is Lord David Attenborough, who filmed that wonderful big film. Anyway, Sir David Attenborough is still active. He's 97 years old. But they stayed in touch with them all those years. Then there were the ordinary people, the people that had nothing. People like the family that took care of my brother. Wonderful people. The British people came forth and opened their hearts and homes. Only 9,354 children were actually saved, usually rounded out to 10,000. The first transport of the children were from a Jewish orphanage in Berlin on December the 2nd, 1938. Now this happened from Crystal Night, November the 9th, to December the 2nd. That was hardly a month before this all started. Can you imagine anybody working that fast today? They have to shove papers around and go through this and that. Well, they worked fast, and it's a good thing they did. Well, the last transport left with a Dutch Christian lady who was only 25 years old. She faced down Eichmann in Vienna and brought out 600 children on one train. My brother and I received our visas to go to Sweden 3 days before Mama got her permission from London to work in the household of her cousins, the Lowenthals, who had emigrated to Great Britain in 1934. They were instrumental in getting her out and getting us onto the Kindertransport rather than going to Sweden, which was a blessing, really, because my uncle didn't want my mother. He just wanted Bert and me. So we were overjoyed that we could all be together. Of course, saying goodbye to all our relatives was very sad. I remember saying goodbye to my grandmother. She was only 69 years old. She was such a wonderful woman. At the railroad station, that was the first time I'd ever seen her cry. She went to the old age home in Frankfurt, and from there she was deported. She had always been a part of our lives, as had all our other relatives. We left with one small suitcase each, about the size you take on the Southwest Airlines. It's not very big. And we had, a few dollars, a few marks. Today it would be almost nothing. All the clothes that we wore were made by our mother and grandmother. Then we couldn't buy anything new, so you took the old clothes and tore them apart and resewed them. We had 10 marks with us. Even in those days, that wasn't much money, and we had little else with us. But that was unimportant. The main thing was that we got out. The scene at the railroad station wasn't very happy, as you can imagine. Some of the parents didn't even come. It was too painful for them to see their children go. Some others didn't want to let them go. They held on to them. Others ran off saying goodbye. Most of the children were not as upset as the parents, of course, which is usual. I thought we were going on a holiday. I thought you go to an island, like Coney Island. You sit in the sand and you dig in the water, not realizing this was a big country. The train went forward with a lurch, and we were on our way. I can't remember too much about the train ride, except when it suddenly stopped, I heard the Gestapo boots coming in to our compartment that was at the Dutch border. Looking into our suitcases, they screamed at us, "You Jewish dogs, do you have any diamonds?" Now, they were all a bunch of chochums, if you know what I mean. They weren't very bright. I'm sure they're not the brightest of them. And they searched diamonds. Now, would anybody with any sense, any parent, have put diamonds in their child's suitcase, number one? Number two, I don't think there were any Jews left in Germany in 1939 that still had diamonds. And they certainly weren't going to risk their children's lives for something like that. So anyway, finally we continued on, and we crossed the Dutch border into Holland. Well, as soon as if you looked out the windows, you could see the people in the fields. They were waving to us, and it was a different atmosphere, even though we were inside the train. Everybody seemed to breathe a little easier. Now, finally, we got to the first stop in Holland, and there were Dutch ladies on the platform served us cocoa and fruit that I had never seen, because we weren't allowed to have any fruit from the tropics. So we didn't have any oranges, we didn't have any bananas. I'd never seen one. From the time I was very little when we lived in Astheim, I didn't remember that. We probably didn't have the means to get anything like that. And later on, we couldn't buy anything that was grown in the tropics. So I had my first orange in Holland, and I got a big hug, and nobody spat in our face. The train continued on to Hoek van Holland, the port for Rotterdam. We boarded a little ship and crossed the English Channel at night. We arrived in Harwich on the East Coast early in the morning. It was a glorious, bright, sunshiny English day, May 23rd, 1939. That was our day of liberation, May 23rd, 1939. We were so lucky. We were directed to another train bound for Liverpool Street Station in London. And if any of you have been to Liverpool Street Station, you will see some statues of the Kindertransport children that are there permanently. And Mama's cousins picked us up in London, in a beautiful new car. And as soon as we were going on the way, my brother Bert threw up on the cousin's wife's new purple shoes. That was our introduction to Great Britain. So we went a little bit further, and he gave us some even better news that he was bankrupt. And I've been thinking all these years, if he was bankrupt, what was he doing driving in such a beautiful new car? But anyway. So where were we going to stay? Where were we going to live? Anyway, and he sold the house. But Mama could stay and work for the new owners who were due to arrive from Vienna next week. After a few weeks, Mama had a nervous breakdown, and I wasn't surprised that she waited that long to have a nervous breakdown, because she deserved it, after all she went through. But what could she do? She persevered, and she kept on working, and even if she crawled on all fours, and she made it. What could she do? She had no choice. She sure couldn't go back to Germany. She had no money. She couldn't speak English, so she had no choice. Another dilemma, Bert and I had no lodgings. Well, Uncle knew the president of the Coventry Synagogue. Coventry is an industrial town in the middle of Great Britain, near Birmingham. It's a beautiful city. It may be industrial, but it has a lot of trees. And between the two of them, they found homes for 55 children. Bert was eventually sent to the Shepherds, Mom and Pop, and Peter, their son, and Mary, their daughter. They called him Bertie. Pop was a mailman, and Mom became a bus conductor at the onset of war. The Summers where I went to live were better off financially, but they treated me very shabbily. I became a cheap maid. And Bert and I lived only a few blocks apart, and we saw each other sometimes during school breaks, or at Hebrew school once a week. I had to cook and clean when I came home from school, and at 10 years old, I was not very adept in the kitchen. Well, I think I was pretty good for what I did. Yeah, I thought I was a terrific cook. Well, I did. I was very consistent. I burnt the meat every day. And not only that, I also knew how to take care of it after it was burnt. I took the newspapers, put them on the floor, and I turned the pot upside down on the floor, and I scraped off the black. Then I put it back in the same pot again. Well, if you have a burnt pot, you can't use it again. Well, I didn't know that. I figured it would go up. Well, let me tell you, they ate it. Either they didn't have any taste buds, or they were stupid, or both. But I've managed to get through that. And in school, I was not too happy either. I was not a very good student. I either didn't have what they called sitzfleisch, I couldn't sit long enough, or my thoughts were somewhere else. But anyway, I was not a good student. But I was lucky because I happened to come upon a teacher, a Mrs. Jacobs, who took me under her wing, and I settled down a little bit, and I learned English very quickly. The headmistress' name was Miss Smith, and try as I might, I couldn't pronounce it. I said Miss, and the kids thought it was delirious. They laughed at me when I talked, And the more they laughed, the more I cried. So, anyway, I adapted to my new surroundings very quickly. Really, there was no choice. And by the time the war broke out on September the 3rd, 1939, I spoke no more English. Well, I'm sure I spoke with a very heavy accent. I wouldn't have dared. The English would have literally killed me if I spoke German. And they called the Germans the Boche, which was a hangover from the First World War, from the French. So I spoke English, and I had no one to speak German to. You know, the kitchen sink wouldn't talk to me, and even the cat wouldn't talk to me. So I had to talk English. My unhappiness with the Salmons family wasn't helped by the fact that I was the scapegoat for their children's misbehavior. John was 2 years older than I, and Esther was 2 years younger. John teased me incessantly. Esther and I slept in one bed, which she wet every night. Well, I used my Yiddish cup, and I took my raincoat, I wrapped myself up in my raincoat, and I slept on the floor. Took my pillow, and I slept on the floor. And if any of you have been in an English house during the winter, it is ice cold. Even today, they don't heat their houses the way we do. So, but I survived. But don't go to Great Britain in the wintertime. Whatever you do, you'll regret it. You know, it's like going to Iceland in the winter. As the war progressed, the English needed factory workers, so Mama found a factory job. Now she could support herself and rented rooms with 3 other refugee friends. But she still did not have enough money to support Bert and myself. She took in homework at night and saved enough money to dream about going to the United States. What a dream. Well, Mama showed me 2 telegrams she received from the Swiss Red Cross. She had asked about our relatives. They came back as undeliverable, which is not a good sign. I knew that she was worried, but in my childish way, I assured her the British would work hard to help everybody. And they did. They were in a terrible war for 2 whole years, from September the 3rd until December the 7th, 1941. Anyway, Bert and I went to visit Mama whenever we had a school break, despite the fact that the bombing had started. We were so happy when we were together. When it came time to go back to Coventry, as soon as the train started to move, Bert started to cry. He was always the first one to do something. And I, the brave one, started to cry with him. I tried to repress it, but I still remember seeing the tears coming down, so I couldn't hold it back. Coventry was a favorite target of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. They were aiming for the Triumph Motor Works and the Jaguar plant, which had converted to war weapons. But instead, they hit the center of the city, and they really destroyed it, including the centuries-old cathedral. They came back a week later and finished it off. That was November the 14th, 1940. There were many casualties. The destruction was devastating. All communication in and out of the city were cut. but the British kept a stiff upper lip. The Simon house was damaged the first time around, and we had evacuated to a small village near Banbury, not far from Oxford, in the vicinity of Oxford. Finally, the Red Cross was able to connect us to each other. My mother in London and Bert in a damaged house in Coventry. The conditions we were living under only made my distaste for Mr. Simon more pronounced. He was an abuser, and I was petrified, but had no escape. My writing paper, my only means of communication with my mother, had disappeared. And I had to wait until we went to London again to tell her what was going on. And then we went to the Bloomsbury House, which is a branch, was a branch, and still is today, of HIAS, which is the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. They help everybody. And they found me a boarding school in Hertfordshire, which was wonderful. And then I started to really live and breathe. Between the two of them, they found me a wonderful boarding school. Okay. The school was situated on an estate belonging to a British colonel fighting in North Africa. He had loaned his estate to the London County Council for the duration of the war. The teachers were like mothers to us. We were 36 girls. 2 of us were Jewish, and there were two little girls from the Spanish Civil War with us. I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember the Spanish Civil War broke out in 1937, and it was vicious. I was well treated and didn't mind doing my share to keep the house and grounds in good shape. I don't know how good an education I got, but I was very happy there, and my English was good. I learned to love Shakespeare. They weren't very good in teaching science and other languages and so on, but I loved it there. I was assigned to Alma the goat. Well, Alma and I had a good relationship. We talked to each other, although she smelled like a goat, I didn't care. I was happy. Now you all go home and get yourself a goat, get rid of your dog. You won't have to pay the vet what you pay now, and you don't have the droppings from the goat, they're good for the garden. Yeah, I'm telling you. And then after I think back on it, remember, Colin Powell's wife was named Alma. I have a guilty feeling about that. Okay. Well, in the meantime, Bert was sent to a warm and loving family in Hartford, not from far where I was. It was time for his bar mitzvah, and my mother was afraid, the family, that although they loved him a lot, that they were going to convert him. So he was taken from the family in Coventry, and they wouldn't even come to the door to say goodbye to him. They got so attached to him. And but then he was sent to the Pettits in Hartford, and they were wonderful. They were extraordinary people. Mrs. Pettit slept on the floor when our mother came to visit to get some respite from the bombing. I was only able to stay in school until I was 14 and a half years old, because the school was not equipped to teach beyond that age. Unless you had a scholarship or money, you went to work. And there was a war on. That was not the English priority. So I returned to London and went to work for a dentist. And I worked for a dentist for over 50 years. When I came to the US and in London, and they're all a bunch of Meshuggah, if I know what I mean. I hope there are no dentists in the crowd. The first day on the job, I cleaned up glass from a bomb which had fallen on the field across from the office. Every night, when the sirens went off, we went to the area shelter, except me. You know, I was really a hero. Nothing was going to hurt me. One night, the ceiling caved in and the windows came in, and I came very close to being cut. After that, I was the first one in the shelter every night. Yeah, and we had fun in the shelter. We didn't sleep. We joked around all day, all night. Well, on June the 5th, 1944 was D-Day. And the invasion of Europe had begun under General Dwight Eisenhower. Well, we knew something was going on because we noticed the planes the day before, planes were going south. Droves and droves, you couldn't see a pin between them. So that something was going on. Mama had started to inquire if we could go to the United States. But remember, the war was still on. Eventually, we did get our visas, although the war was still on. It was a hard decision for Mama to make because of Bert's education. But Bert had won a scholarship, which would have taken him through Cambridge, through his PhD, room and board, everything paid for, and spending money. Well, that's one of us. What about the rest of us? You know, but she and me. So she decided that we would all be better off in the United States. And I think she made a good decision. Well, you know, Mama, because of Bert's education, but she decided we would all have a better chance in the U.S. We left Britain with heavy hearts at the beginning of April 1945 on the old Aquitania, which had been converted to a Canadian hospital ship. We sailed from Greenock, Scotland to Halifax, Nova Scotia. That's why we didn't come in at Ellis Island, which Ellis Island, I think, was closed the minute the war started. From there, we traveled for a train from Montreal, St. Albans, Vermont, to New York City. It was April the 12th, 1945, a day before President Roosevelt died. The war was in its final stages in Europe. Mama's sister, brother, and their families welcomed us very warmly. The British were wonderful to us. We shall always be indebted to them for their indomitable spirit, their kindness and compassion. They saved our lives and those of many others. No other country in the world would take in Jewish refugees. There was a lot of anti-Semitism in the world. It seems to be repetitive or ongoing. A few countries made it a little easier, such as Chile, Costa Rica, and the Belgian Congo. Even in this country, it was hard to get in. President Roosevelt had members in his cabinet who didn't want Jews. Well, I'm sure you're all aware of that. There was no place for them to go when the Holocaust started, the greatest tragedy that ever befell the Jewish people. Some of the children that arrived on the Kindertransport were picked up by various agencies and placed in hostels. The youngest ones went to families. Some of the older ones were taken in as household help or nannies. Others were placed with loving families all over the British Isles. They went to England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Some adjusted very well. Others had a hard time being torn away from their families. The younger ones forgot their parents very quickly, as you can imagine, if they're 1.5, 2, or 3 years old. Some were converted to Christianity or were adopted by families who grew to love them as much or more than their own children. As they became older, some joined the armed forces and fought valiantly. Some fell in battle. Some joined the Jewish Brigade. After the war, a few were reunited with their families or siblings, but most of the uniting was very strained and difficult. The children had not seen their parents for at least 6 years. The parents had unspeakable horrors to deal with. Many had psychological or mental problems, as you can imagine, and could never get used to each other again. The children had acquired a different culture, and a different way of life. Most of the children never saw their dear ones again. All those who were left behind perished. In the summer of 1989, oh my goodness, it's so long ago already, we had a 50-year reunion in London, which we attended. We were addressed by many dignitaries. Amongst them was Margaret Thatcher, the then Prime Minister. Of course, there were the countless ordinary people who gave us love and shelter. The Kindertransport is but a small part of Holocaust history, but an important one. We were the ones to whom nothing happened at all, but something did happen. We were spared the horrors of the death camps. We were uprooted, transported to a different culture, and faced not the horror of the camps, but a very human mixture of kindness, selfishness, indifference, occasional exploitation, and the selflessness of ordinary people faced with needy children. Many British values have stayed with us. Fair play comes to mind, and that's not cricket. You know, if you tell that to somebody, they'll know what you mean. We need to defend the helpless and stand our ground. Don't give in to bullies. Be kind to all people. Be sure to help your parents and your grandparents if there are any young ones here. I appreciate all help given to me. And I'm sure your grandparents in the audience would too. And do some volunteer work, you youngsters, whenever you can. Save your money. Give some to the Red Cross or the American Heart Association, or help during the summer at the food bank and make some sandwiches. There are many homeless in our communities. Too many. Most of all, work as hard as you can in school. It's very, very important to get a good education. There's nothing that replaces a good education. Okay? And if you don't get it the first time in school, try again and again. And the 5th time, you'll get it. Read as much as you can. Reading is the best thing you could do for yourselves. Okay? And When I came to New York, I had to go back to school. And I thought it was below my dignity. But you know what? I didn't know anything. I was good in English. I skipped all the English. But that's all I knew. I was terrible in arithmetic, math, sciences. Awful, awful. American history, I didn't even know. I knew that George Washington was the first president. That's all I knew. Well, I went to Jamaica High School, and then I went to Queens College at night. And I had to work because we had no money. Do any of you kids in the audience know what it means to have no money? Yeah? Do you know where your next meal is coming from? You're lucky. Also, my husband was a refugee child, but he was lucky enough to come to this beautiful country in 1937 with his parents. And my brother-in-law came the year earlier, and he lived with his aunt and uncle in Brooklyn. My husband went through the New York City schools. He was drafted to the U.S. Army in 1943 when he was 19. And first he was a dishwasher. That was a big distinction. And then he was a medic. And then he became a translator for General Patton when he went into Germany. What do you think of that? Okay, and I have 2 wonderful grandchildren, and I now have a great-granddaughter, too. And I've been volunteering for the museum now for 32 years, maybe. I also did volunteer work for the Dallas County Probate Court, for people who are under guardianship, for the Vogel Alcove, which is a daycare center for children of the homeless. And I made meals for people who were ill when I was able. I knit for cancer patients. I read a lot. I belong to a book club. I used to go to Torah study at Shares Israel. Well, I'm now living at the wonderful place called the Midtown Legacy, and I have wonderful friends there. Some of them are here, and they're all first-class people. And all the people I've met over the years in Dallas are just wonderful, okay? And I belong to all the museums in the whole area, Dallas and Fort Worth. And I love the opera, and I have some friends that go with me. And above all, of course, I miss my husband, who passed away. It's going to be 16 years already. And my son passed away 2 years ago. And my daughter still lives here. And I have 2 wonderful grandchildren, who one's in New York and one is in Louisville, Kentucky, and here's a little girl. And my brother and sister-in-law live at the Legacy where I live. And that's it. I'm an open book.
Thank you, Maggie. Can you hear me now? Okay. So thank you all for joining us very much. There are people going through the audience right now collecting any questions that you might have. But I thought that I would start off. Maggie, when you were after Kristallnacht, but before your mom decided to leave Germany, did you have any idea of what might be coming in Germany itself? Did you have any sense? And I know that you were young, but people frequently say, well, German Jews should have left. They should have known. What do you think about that statement?
Well, today, of course, I think differently than I did then.
Okay, so tell us how you think today.
today I think they should have left. They should have seen some warning signs.
But they had the same problems there that there are at our borders now, which is that it was very hard to get
terrible.
out.
Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about that? You didn't
Yes,
really talk about that
That
process.
troubles me greatly. I know not everybody feels that way, but I do, because I think that if people would not want to come to the U.S. if they didn't have problems, if they didn't fear for their lives, if they couldn't make a living, if they were pursued in any way. I don't think most of the people, I mean, how many people are murderers and criminals? Very few. Most of these people are crying for help, and we need to give it to them. I think it's absolutely horrible for a country that is so rich and has everything to turn their backs on human beings. What they're doing, putting up wires that people are cut and refusing them water. I mean, common decency. Anybody that believes in anything would give a cat something. They spend more money on dogs and cats than they do on human beings. It's terrible. Absolutely awful. It's heartbreaking.
Okay, Maggie, this is a question from an audience member. Could you tell us what made you decide to move to Texas and to Dallas?
What made me what?
Decide to move to Texas and to Dallas.
Well, my brother was here first, but that wasn't the reason we came. My husband wanted to get out of New York because the living conditions in New York were too busy. And he didn't think it was a good place to raise children. And we had the opportunity to come to either Chicago or the Southwest. And I didn't want to shovel snow anymore, so we decided to come here. That's the truth.
Maggie knows this, but I came to Texas ultimately from outside of Buffalo, New York, and I am absolutely with you on this one. Okay, another audience question is, what is your favorite memory from your childhood?
My
if you
favorite
can pick
memory?
one. Yeah.
Oh, playing with our animals. When my brother and I, we had a doll's carriage, and we put the cats in there, and we dressed them up, and then the cats jumped out of the carriage. They wouldn't hold still, and he ran after the cat to get the cat, and stuff like that, little things. And then we had an orchard behind our house, and we used to slide down the banks of that, and things like that kids used to, because don't forget, we left there when I was only 6 years old.
Yeah, you were young. Maggie, what was your mother's life like once you all came to the United States?
My mother's life in the United States?
Yes.
Well, fortunately, my brother had always taken good care of her. And she lived with us after Harry and I got married. And her life was a little easier. And she lived to see all her 5 grandchildren.
Nice.
And she was a wonderful woman. I mean, she was as good as gold. And she had a heart as big as a mountain. And we always had a house full of people. They came because of her.
Very nice. Final question. What was it like to start out life living next to your brother, and now when you're in your older years to be living next to your brother?
Well, we don't see each other very often.
Okay. So
Really?
you're saying it's good.
Maybe once or twice a week we see each other. I try to make it a point after dinner at night to go over and say hello to him. Otherwise, I wouldn't see him.
And the reason she wouldn't see him, I have to tell you a little bit of insider baseball, everybody who's here, which is that Maggie makes me tired. Anytime you see Maggie from early in the morning till late at night, her response is, I don't have time to talk, I'm busy. And she's on her way to book club or conversations or cards or dinner or lunch or meeting people. It's just amazing. So thank you all so much for joining us today and sharing your time with the museum and with Maggie as she shared her testimony. And wishing you all a safe and happy and cool afternoon.
I didn't touch.